I'm Chris Surprenant, and I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the University of New Orleans. This video examines when free speech is likely to cause non-contingent harms, and in those cases, who should limit free speech and how. You are likely familiar with two classical works of dystopian literature, George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. What is similar about both 1984 and Brave New World is that the state aims to prevent citizens from knowing the truth about the world in which they live. In 1984, the state acts directly to restrict access to information, going so far to punish acts of individualism and even thought crimes. In Brave New World, the reverse seems true. Instead of restricting the information available to the citizens, they are flooded with so much information and sensory input that they cannot tell what is true or false. In both cases, it could be argued that preventing people from knowing the truth is for their own good, just like preventing someone from falsely shouting fire in a crowded building prevents people from likely harm. So why is it problematic for the state to limit free speech in this way? The answer connects to the function of the state. If there is a justification of state authority and its monopoly on the legitimate use of force, that justification is grounded in the protection of the rights of the individual citizens. So using the force of law to limit free speech would have to connect to protecting individual rights. In the case where free speech is likely to cause non-contingent harms, it is easier to make this connection. But in cases where speech causes contingent harms, such as when someone becomes offended, this connection is more tenuous. It is almost impossible to see how someone has a right not to be offended. Rights entail obligations. If I have a right to something, that means you generally have an obligation not to act in a way that interferes with my pursuit of that thing. If the function of the state is to protect rights, then the state is justified in prohibiting your interfering behavior when your behavior violates my rights. But when it comes to the possibility of a right not to be offended, anyone can be offended by anything. While it may be good manners generally to avoid offending other people, it is not reasonable to claim that there is an obligation not to offend. To expect the state to step in and use force to protect individual preferences in this way is also unreasonable. But what about private individuals or private institutions? Generally, it does not seem unreasonable for a private individual or institution to try to limit free speech within its domain. If I am easily offended by profane language, it seems perfectly reasonable for me to restrict who I invite into my house or otherwise associate with based on the language that they use around me. The same reasoning seems to apply for private organizations. It is not unreasonable for a church, for example, to restrict the type of speech that happens inside. The restriction is consistent with promoting the aim of that institution. But what about when restrictions on free speech are contrary to promoting the aim of the institution? Are such restrictions appropriate in those cases? Here, the obvious example is certain limitations on free speech within colleges and universities. I say certain limitations because there is no question that some limitations on free speech are necessary, even within a university setting. If individuals had the freedom to disrupt classes or otherwise interfere with instruction, those disruptions would prevent the institution from fulfilling its mission. Other limitations on free speech at colleges and universities are more troubling. If the primary function of the university is to pursue truth and advance knowledge, then limitations on free speech, such as shutting down guest lecturers or otherwise preventing invited speakers from having their ideas heard, even if those ideas may be potentially offensive, seems inconsistent with the institutional aim of the university. Similarly, a professor who limits the free expression of his students by being overly dogmatic or political, or students who, through peer pressure or intimidation, prevent their classmates from expressing seemingly unpopular views within the academic setting, also undermine the goals of the institution. The solution is not that we should advocate all free speech in all circumstances, but rather that we should think about both the nature of the institution and the kind of free speech in question. It seems that governments are almost never justified in limiting free speech. The only cases where such restrictions are justified is when that speech will lead directly to a non-contingent harm. For private institutions, whether or not they are justified in free speech depends on the nature of that institution and the goals it is trying to accomplish.